I think everyone comes out of university and thinks they're going to walk into this great fancy job. While they're in university, you need to do some type of coaching. Whatever it is, just learning to coach and learning to communicate. I think that's paramount.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back. My name is James Grigson. I'm joined here by Paul Sealey. Paul, thanks for coming on, mate.
Oh, my pleasure. Good to speak to you.
Paul, you've been all over the world, mate. You started here in Australia. You studied in Australia. You spent nearly 14 years over at Texas A&M in the US. You've been back here for a little over 5 years now. Your current role, high performance manager for the AFL National Academies. I want to take a step right back to the beginning because all I've got is finished studies here at ACU in '99, and then went over to Texas A&M. What was that journey like? When did you first realize that you knew you wanted to work in sport and you wanted to be committed to sports science? I assume that would be hopefully prior to your actual degree at ACU, right?
No, well, actually, I've always been involved in sport. I swam at a very high level in Australia, sort of state, national, age group and open level for a long time. So I was always really passionate about exercise science and sports science. And that's sort of how my mind works in terms of understanding physiology and understanding science, language and history and maths. Sorry, maths I'm quite strong at. But so that was sort of my area that I always knew I wanted to go into sort of sports science. I was fortunate enough to get into ACU, and that just sort of had a bit of a light bulb moment when I was going through that and going through a lot of the exercise physiology, that it came to me quite easily, and it's just something that I really enjoyed. But I could relate it back to all the training that I was doing and all the different periodization and different energy systems and how that all sort of fit in together. And I was doing a fair bit of swim coaching during that stage as well. So being able to sort of put some of that science into actually application was pretty beneficial. Had a bit at the end when I finished my undergraduate degree. I had to decide what I was going to do. I looked at osteopathy, decided I wanted to do too much more school, so I ended up doing an honours year, and that sort of really sort of piqued my interest more in the academic side of things, and that was sort of the track that I was going to go. I was going to be a university professor, and a lot of my guys that I studied under at ACU, Justin Kemp and some of those guys, had all studied overseas. So I knew that to sort of broaden my horizons a little bit, I needed to go overseas, and I was looking to actually go to Canada. But before I went over there, so I did an honours year. I did some backpacking through the US. I did a summer camp, and as I was traveling, I saw the sporting facilities that you have in the US, and I was like, no, I don't want to deal with the snow and the cold in Canada, and was fortunate enough to apply and get into Texas A&M. So I was, came back to Australia for a little bit, worked 4 or 5 jobs just to try and save up enough money. I was very fortunate at A&M that I got an academic scholarship, and then I was doing some teaching. So I was teaching a lot of basic strength and conditioning, health and fitness classes, running classes, and what that allowed me to do was, get in-state tuition, because if I had had international fees, it would have got very, very expensive. So I was sort of very fortunate and did a lot of applied. Was all gung-ho to do a PhD, but then a lot of the physiology studies that you do in the US are based on rats and rat modeling. So I didn't really want to get stuck in a lab killing rats and sort of going that stream. I was really fortunate during my master's degree in sports physiology at Texas A&M is you have to do 2 semesters as strength and conditioning. So the first semester you train as an athlete. So you go through all the different cycles. So you go through general adaptation, basic strength, power, all the way through an off-season training program, as well as doing all the speed and conditioning. So you really understand what the body feels like. And while you're doing that, you're also doing all the theory. And then the second semester was you essentially just helping one of the full-time coaches. And I was fortunate that when I went in there, because I came from a strong coaching background and also a strong swimming background, is they pretty much just handed me swimming and diving and said, they're yours, take them, run with them.
Sweet.
And I started helping out with football. They gave me a lot of the freshmen because I'd come from a strong coaching, teaching background. They gave me the freshmen to sort of simplify the Olympic lifts and a lot of the lifts and teach them how to do it, take them through a sort of 6 to 10 week introduction program before they assimilated into the normal program. So when I sort of got over there with football, we we tested, we trained, we retested, we evaluated. And to me, that was human performance. And working at Texas A&M, they recruited some of the best athletes in the country. So I was lucky with swimming and diving and athletics and some of the other sports. I was worked with a lot of Olympians and national record holders and world record holders. So I'd like to say I helped them on their journey, but the coaches, when they recruit phenomenal athletes, make you look really, really good.
Yeah, I'm sure you would have seen the best of the best really in that scenario. The connection or the link to Texas A&M, where did that come from? So was there anybody locally that you were able to refer to that were able to get your foot in the door at A&M?
So I applied to probably about 4 or 5 universities, and I was actually going to go to University of Texas. So while I was backpacking through the States, I'd had a friend that lived in Texas, actually my now wife.
Awesome.
And I had an interview at Texas, and I was all gung-ho to get there, but they couldn't guarantee me a teaching position straight away. So I was going to have a lot of international fees. Texas A&M sort of came to the plate with a scholarship and some money. At the time, they had Dr. Wilmore and Dr. Armstrong. For those that know anything about sort of exercise physiology, Dr. Wilmore is sort of the guru on body compositions, and Dr. Armstrong is the muscle guru. So I was very fortunate that I could study under those guys. So it was a really reputable program, and that I got a chance to sort of jump into that when I was looking more at the academic side of things, more so than the sporting side of things.
Wow. So for the people, like the young kids at home, in terms of having to apply overseas, was it something that you organised here? Was it a part? Now there seems to be heaps of pathways from universities connecting students from domestic to international universities. Was there anything that existed in that way at the time, or did you just have to figure that out yourself?
Pretty much figured that out myself. You go through and do the GRE, which is sort of essentially like SAT, and you send that application. You decide which universities. Now that was showing my age a little bit. That was back in sort of 99.
I already dropped 99 before, mate. The people know.
Yeah, I know. I'm showing my age a little bit. Apologies. But essentially, I went through. You send your applications into the universities, and they either say yes or no. And then they've got to find out what your sort of background and expertise is. And as I said, I was very lucky at A&M that I had an opportunity to teach in the health and fitness. So I did a lot of resistance training, a lot of running, a lot of swimming, and that was sort of the way that I could afford to get over there. A lot of other young aspiring coaches try and get graduate assistant positions, and that was another way you could have done it. But it's highly competitive and really, really hard to get into. I was sort of fortunate I got into the strength and conditioning almost through a little bit of a backdoor, is that I had to fulfill the requirements for my classes, but because they gave me the swimming and diving programs and I helped with football, essentially I was volunteering full-time as well as getting college credit. As I was sort of going through a lot of that, when I finished graduating, I had a year of occupational training. So I taught about 3/4 position in the kinesiology department, and they built the rest of the position in the strength and conditioning in the athletic department. As I sort of went through, they sponsored me on a B1, B2 visa, and eventually the athletic department said, no, we want you full-time. And essentially I worked 12 years full-time as an assistant coach and a senior assistant. Some of it was just right place, right time, but it's also, I like to say a little bit, it was just my work ethic, is that I would, while I was teaching, which was still sort of a 20, 30-hour week, I was probably still putting in 60 hours in the gym, sweeping up, helping out, writing programs, assisting, learning from coaches, and just sort of cutting my teeth that way. I was lucky that I had a girlfriend at the time, but I didn't have a young family, so I could sort of really devote a lot of time to help out.
Yeah, and hearing that story, just the phrase any means necessary comes up in my head by what you have just said, almost articulating that journey. I'm going, gee, there would have been a hurdle there, would have been a hurdle there because you international fees, and then you would have had to figure some things out. So I really get a sense of an attitude of any means necessary. When you were going around,
and some of that was just making yourself really valuable. That because I sort of invested so heavily into the programs that I worked with over there, the university sort of jumped through some hoops to make sure that they sponsored me for the work visas further down the track. So there was always some hurdles along the way, but as long as you make yourself valuable and you can kind of find what your niche in the market is, people will go to bat for you.
And the coaching experience that you would have had prior to that, your swim coaching and your previous experience in Australia would have helped tremendously. Do you credit some of the skills that you're able to bring over to the table in the US to some of the work that you did back home before you left?
Yeah, well and truly. My wife always jokes about the coaching voice, is that sometimes when I go from coaching and back home that I've got to make sure I'm not too loud. And now that I'm sort of stuck in the office, now that when I do coach, I lose my voice quite quickly. But in terms of when I was sort of going through university, I was working as just a swim coach, swim instructor, and I'd have some classes where I had deaf students and some classes where I had blind students. So it really sort of solidified the way you communicate to athletes. And that's sort of something that I work with a lot of coaches that are aspiring and that are far smarter than I am, but sometimes they have difficulties relating to the athletes and getting there and being able to motivate them and be able to communicate. And that's probably one of my strengths, at least when I was a lot younger, being able to communicate. And being in the US, having an Australian accent probably also cut through some barriers with the football teams. And that sort of stop back and listen to you and say, come on, keep talking, coach. So, but a lot of time it's just simplifying the message and giving them some good positive reinforcement and having a laugh, but also understanding, I'm there to help them.
I couldn't, I had 2 years as an S&C bouncing around in a couple of different junior roles, but my work as a under 12 rugby coach helped me dramatically with, the 25-year-old rugby league player that I was working with, just because you have that experience having to simplify things or think of things in a different way, having those different experiences. So for me personally, having that alternate experience to the actual S&C gig, but still with the underlying tone of learning how to communicate with people was awesome for me, even just on a small journey. So I couldn't recommend it enough, just trying to cut your teeth in any sort of coaching.
And some of that is also the coaching structures that they set up in the US. So I was certified while I was in the US, and I'm also certified in Australia. To be certified as a collegiate strength and conditioning coach, which is sort of the gold standard now in the US, you have to do a semester's worth of coaching. So that's about 600 hours, like a full internship. And a lot of that is being able to run groups of 15 to sort of 35 to 45 athletes. And sometimes you feel more like a traffic cop than a strength and conditioning coach. But it's just being able to cut your teeth and understanding that, one, if I'm not loud, how do I articulate and how can I get my message across to the whole group, whether that's breaking them up in small groups, whether that's being loud or being able to simplify, and even just in terms of your program design, how can you maximize your time? Because in the NCAA, you have very much time restrictions with athletes. So it's how can you get the most bang and really improve the collective group? Yes, there's a lot of other individual things you'd like to do, but you just run out of time. So, and that's sort of how you need to cut your teeth a little bit. The Australian certifications are great. There's not as much emphasis on coaching. And that's where where my role is now, getting out and talking to the young coaches and getting them understand how to communicate and how to articulate to a group.
And oftentimes sports science or strength and conditioning will poo-poo personal training just because there's not as much qualifications or academic rigor to what they need to do to become qualified. But your point before about learning how to navigate a room of 20 to 30 to 40 people, have a time constraint and be able to articulate your message and get those people to deliver, is a skill that I learned from PTing when I started at 17 as a PT, which carried me into being able to articulate quite clearly when I started S&C.
And the other part of it is just being able to marry up the strength conditioning with the sports science. In the US, at least when I started in the industry, was very much strength conditioning, and you a lot of former athletes, but a lot of them didn't have the formal education. So they've done a history or geography or education. So there was a little bit of resistance, and Australia was far ahead in terms of their integration of their strength conditioning and their sports science. The US are catching up very, very quickly, but it's taken a little bit of a shift philosophically within their programs. And we hit some hurdles initially because one of the issues, at least in the US, is you've got the athletes for 4 years and the coach wants to win now. So if you're trying to do a research study and it takes 12 months to get the data back to them, they're not going to get involved, and you're not going to say, okay, I've got this great protocol that we're going to use to improve them, that we're going to put 12 on another program where there's no intervention. If it's going to work, they want the whole lot. So it took a while in the US to change the mindsets of being able to integrate the sports science in. And as I said, they've caught up to the Australians in terms of GPS and heart rate monitor and heart rate variability, and really starting to look at that. But that was sort of Australia's strength point for a long time.
You read my mind. That was my next question, because it is well documented that we being Australia, have been far ahead, or at least we were in the sports science aspects. what were some of the techniques that you were able to employ to get the attention of the coaches or the people that didn't necessarily understand it? How were you going about trying to get their attention or their respect that this thing works, knowing that, like to your point, it is a long game. It's not something that you can go, ta-da, it works, look at it. It's something that you have to they need to give you time for it to work. How did you go about that?
I was fortunate with some of my coaches that some of them had come from a little bit of a sports science background or understood it a little bit. I know one of the first sort of hurdles that I faced is that in the US, they have a lot of athletic trainers that aren't really physios. They're sort of first responders, and they're great educated people that do really well, but it sort of hit some initial barriers where I just wanted to do just some cold tub and some contrast training. And I was told that I couldn't do any contrast hot and colds because they might have heart attacks. And I was like, we're talking about elite athletes here. So we at least introduced the cold tubs post-exercise, started introducing a lot of the compression garments, particularly for soccer. We'd play on a Friday night, we'd get on a flight or a bus and travel for 2 or 3 hours and then play Sunday. So being able to speed up that recovery process, and we started introducing a lot of those, our injury rates dropped dramatically. Not that we had a lot, but just it's a 3-month really intense soccer period for those athletes. So being able to maximize recovery was and the fact the coaches bought into that, it was interesting that the athletic trainer turned around a couple of years later, was like, I read this great research on contrast training. And then one of the coaches looked at her and just shook his head and said, he told you about that 3 years ago and shot it down. So we also started using a lot of heart rates. So we talk about the art of coaching. So before GPS and we'd have to we'd look at a game, and when the assistant coaches and I would work out who ran the most, who needs more recovery and training, the ones that sat on the bench, we need to up their conditioning. And we did a lot of it sort of almost by feel. And then we started adding sort of heart rate monitoring into it as I was leaving the program to come back to Australia. That we started looking at GPS and how to integrate that into the program. And that's sort of one thing that sometimes we can get stuck on a little bit is almost too much science. And I think we've lost that track a little bit. There is an art to coaching and understanding what your athletes are feeling and how to motivate them. I always had 3 or 4 athletes that were my gauges of what we could do for training and what we couldn't. And then just having the old fashioned just chat with them, how we're feeling, where are we at.
What do you look for on those 4 athletes? Are you looking for diversity? So are you looking for someone who, obviously they all have to be good communicators and they have to trust you to be able to speak to you. But from a gauge, if I think about what I would want from a gauge, it would almost be the people, kind of 2 people that are normally the ones that complain a lot and 2 people that normally the ones that don't. Is there any sort of personality types that you look for when you're looking for your gauge athletes?
Yeah, so I worked a lot of sports in the US, but one of my main sports was women's soccer, and they were just overachievers and probably some of the hardest workers that I've been fortunate enough to deal with. And you had your couple that you knew you could sort of push, and when they were dragging a little bit, you might have gone just a step too far, and you had the other ones on the spectrum. So it's just a matter of just sort of watching the conditioning workouts, watching the training. And I was, again, had great relationships with the coaches that once they got what they needed out of training, they were happy to call it quits. They just didn't want to, if we had 2 hours allocated for training and we did it in 90 minutes, they wouldn't say, oh, let's get another half an hour. It's like, no, we've done enough for today. So that's sort of just that coach's eye and just having a chat with them. And it's, college athletics is a little bit different to the dynamics that I deal with now, is because we could control everything. You knew exactly what they were doing with school. There wasn't outside jobs. It was almost like a professional organization, and the amount of access I had was amazing to nutritionists, doctors, physios, S&C, high caliber coaches and feedback. So we kept on top of it, but again, we tried to slowly integrate the sports science into it.
And so, talking about that transition from going from almost Willy Wonka's chocolate factory in terms of the amount of access that you have and the toys and I guess the quality of the facilities over there, to back to the Australian environment, which has, especially at that time, would have slightly more well-rounded coaches or people that have a high level of sports science knowledge than maybe someone that you were dealing with in the US, but you didn't have that bees knees types of equipment. How is that transition coming back to Australia and coming into our environment after spending nearly 15 years in the States?
Great question. So in the US, obviously, there's not a shortage of money. particularly in the college, in the big universities. And I was fortunate enough to be at a big university. So we had 3 weight rooms. Each of them had 16 Olympic platforms and all the dumbbells and both. You could get your force velocity curves on most of the things. So I actually left my wife and I, my 2 kids, left the US without any jobs. It was just I needed a new challenge, and just for our family, it was going to be a good fit to come back. So I took a job at Eastern Rangers Football Club in the sort of TAC Cup, is now the NAB League, and running that. One they asked me when I came back, why am I applying for this position? I was missing coaching because I was doing a little bit of teaching at ACU, but it was just an opportunity to get my sort of football experience back in Australia. And we didn't really have a weight room. We had a couple of rusty bars and a couple of bands. So I could still get a lot of, you don't need fancy equipment. We would set up a little circuit outside, and I could teach them all the fundamentals of no-hand front squats, goblet squats, and introduce them into back squats, and just teach them the basic fundamentals. And again, with the bands, you could do all your rows and pull-ups, and then you're just getting that good muscle balance and good preparation that if they're fortunate enough to get to an AFL club, they had that good solid foundation underneath them, as well as putting a lot of speed development work and running technique work. Australia is getting better in terms of their running technique, but I think that was a big void, at least when I came back sort of 5 or 6 years ago in the youth. Everyone was running. They were saying, okay, we need to run 10, 12 Ks in a game, so we're just going to do endurance running. They forget about cleaning up the technique, doing some speed development, running correctly, and then loading. Sometimes we load first, and then we try and it actually creates too many issues. So, and that's sort of what my role is at the AFL Academy. It's a high performance over all the AFL Academies, is looking at our intervention, making sure that we're doing speed development, technique development. In terms of facilities work and access, I actually had more access to GPS units in Australia than I did in the US. The programs that I used to work with in the US now all have GPS, but to me, getting in and understanding that, I'd done a lot of the theory, so to just cut my teeth and understand that. And I was fortunate enough to work at Eastern Rangers for 3 months and then move across to AFL Vic. And one of my big roles was just to actually monitor the GPS loads for a year and actually educate the coaches on what it actually means. So the old adage was, we lost a game on the weekend, we just weren't fit enough, let's smash them, to actually let's look at the GPS. The game that we lost, we weren't efficient with the ball and we were chasing tail. Our GPS numbers are through the roof. We actually need to back them off a little bit this week rather than trying to load them. So again, it was just a matter of just re-educating the coaches. And a lot of the coaches initially looked at it and said, well, this guy didn't work hard enough. So then you go back and say, well, how about you look at the vision and say, were they just more efficient in their running mechanics? Did we have the ball? So just starting to get that information. I think in the talent pathways, they've got a really good understanding now of how to use the GPS data. And I've got some great staff throughout the country that write great reports for the recruiters and also for their coaches and also for the players. So they're starting to get educated on what they can and can't do. And just as simple as how much high-speed loading do we do in the middle of the week to make sure that we're, bulletproof in terms of hamstring injuries and other soft tissue injuries.
It seems like you would have had to leave your ego at the door when you came back to Australia. It's like you would have had 15 years in the US. You would have been, I assume, well, it sounds like you had fantastic relationships. I assume there would have been some respect from your peers that you would have garnered. And then coming back to Australia, relatively unknown to the Australian industry to an extent, I would say. And then going into a new sport, a sport that you wouldn't have been familiar with, or at least you hadn't worked in from our conversation, with new toys like GPS, you would have had to have sat down and gone, okay, I really need to be a learner here and go back to the roots of what got you to the dance. How was that transition? Because I know people, either if they're going to a new place or a new country, they would have to do something like this, but even transitioning sports, people going from rugby league to AFL would need to do something similar. What words of advice would you have to say for those people that have to go through that transition and leave their ego at the door?
I learned long ago to leave my ego at the door. When I was in the US, I used to train with a female strength coach, and she could bench press more than me and squat more than me when I first started training with her. So I learned long ago that you leave your ego at the door. I've always been fortunate. I've had some great mentors. So that was one of the things when I did come back to Australia, is that I just reached out to a lot of professionals, whether that was a lot of them are in the AFL, high performance managers, GPS specialists, and I just sort of either just sit down and talk with them, say, look, this is who I am. This job's open. I'd be really interested, but also to get a bit of a feel for what they're doing and how they're going about it. And I was happy to go back and as you said, almost eat some humble pie by going back to the Eastern Ranges. But it was probably one of the best experiences just to get back. One, because I was teaching at the time, that just to do the coaching, which I'm passionate about, and that actually opened up a lot of other opportunities for me with AFL Vic. That if I hadn't have taken that backward step at the Eastern Ranges, I probably wouldn't have got the opportunity at AFL Vic, and then probably not the opportunity at the AFL. And it was just sort of putting out my work ethic and my knowledge, and they could see what I could do and what we're doing with the athletes out there, that sort of raised a few eyebrows and opened up a few doors for me.
Yeah, and it certainly seems like people have to do that, right? When they are transitioning, is take that step back to almost take that step forward. When I look at you and having spoken to you, there are a lot of what I would call no nonsense coaches in the industry, but I feel like there's a very no nonsense approach in the US, and some of the conversations that we've had off camera, you've spoke about how regimented the training is over there, and even referenced it just before with the amount of time that you're allocated with these athletes. How was that transition from, it seems like from where I'm at, that it's a very no nonsense culture and environment, especially where you had come from, maybe coming back to Australia where there isn't so much urgency on the time that you have with the athletes. It may be, at least from what I've seen and what I've heard, a little bit less no nonsense. How did you come back in from, the no nonsense culture to maybe something that's slightly a little bit more relaxed over here?
Yeah, so the NCAA regulates how much time in season, out of season. So there's sometimes you might have 8 hours, sometimes you have 20 hours, and that also includes their on-field training as well. So you've got to be really, really careful that I couldn't do a warm-up that lasted sort of 35 minutes, that I needed to make sure. So we would never go for sort of long jogs just to warm up, but there's going to be some dynamic movement, some dynamic flexibility, some muscle activation, and then you're in and rolling, because you just had to get the most bang. Even in the talent pathways, a lot of these athletes we're lucky enough to work with are in school, parents are taking them to training, they've got to get, so you still actually have time constraints, and we almost keep a lot of those same things. And that's sometimes one of the probably the learnings that I've had through my career is understanding that, yes, strength and conditioning is very, very important, but it's also, so is the game and the skill, the tactical, the technical that comes. So if all of a sudden I'm doing a warm up for 45 minutes and there's only 45 minutes of training, then I might be losing my way a little bit. And that was one of the adjustments for me when I came back from the US. In the US, I couldn't do anything with a football or a soccer ball, because then I'd get counted as a coach. Where in Australia, I can do warm ups with football. So that was sort of the big learning for me coming back in. How do you incorporate a football into your warm-up? How can you incorporate kicking? How can you communicate with a coach and say, okay, coach, I need you to do this. And just sort of putting those pieces of the puzzle together. So you still have those same time restrictions, but it's just probably just guys are a little bit different from my perspective. AFL clubs are probably slightly different because they've got a little bit more time with the athletes. But even when you talk to them, they're pretty regimented in terms of, okay, we're on the track, then we're in the gym, then we've got recovery, and then we've got a meal, and we've got meetings. So everyone's going to have their time restrictions.
And it would have been weird even coming back here that it's actually encouraged that you warm up with the ball, right? Like they almost want you to be able to come with creative ideas on how can we get this warm up done right, but include some game aspects in there.
No, well and truly, and as said, I had to sort of, I'd been doing it one way for 12, 14 years, so all of a sudden I have to switch it up a little bit. No, but that was fun, and that was cutting my teeth at the Eastern Ranges really sort of opened that up a little bit, and that's sort of what you got to do sometimes. And it's just a matter of coaching.
Yeah, and now you've referenced your role as a high performance manager for the National Academies. What strikes me is obviously the part in the role that says manager. So you're having to manage what happens nationally, and then the state programs, facilitating staff, facilitating development across a number of different athletes, a number of different levels. And obviously you'd be a key stakeholder within the business at AFL House for people to come talk to. And you've spoken to me before how you're doing a lot of that management style activities and not as much coaching as what you used to do. How has that transition been for you, going from someone who would have coached full time to now having to balance those two things?
My role sort of evolved over time. Initially, when I started AFL, it was looking after the AFL Academy. So we had sort of 60 athletes that I would, on a daily basis, check in on through an AMS smarter-based system. monitor their GPS and communicate and sort of talk with them all the time. We've actually, the last couple of years, decentralised that. So we've pushed that out to all the states. So the Victoria, SA, WA will look after the National Academy. So we're giving more kids more opportunities. And we've also broadened our staff. So my role now is to sort of look after the staff and coach the coaches essentially and manage those. Look at the best type of what GPS is out there. So talking with one, obviously we use Catapult, but also working with Champion Data to see what are some avenues we can go in the future. Just keeping abreast of all the different technologies that are out there. Everyone sends me a sales pitch, and it's just sort of just sorting through those and meeting those and finding out what can we get our most bang for our buck for. And I'm heavily involved in the national combine as well, which is sort of a large part of my role, getting all the pre-season testing done, auditing it, make sure it's done the same throughout the country, sharing that data with all the AFL clubs, as well as chasing up all the medical data. So it's been a very, my progression in the industry has changed very much, from writing basic programs in Excel to doing some high level stuff now, doing a lot more data analytics and monitoring those things, doing a lot of the GPS, writing position descriptions and hiring doctors and physios and nutritionists. And it's been a little bit of a learning curve for me, but it's been great. I still enjoy coaching and getting out there with the athletes, and we have a few opportunities through the year where I get my hands dirty and lose my voice a little bit. But it's also great to be able to mentor and manage some young, aspiring high performance coaches and coaches.
And what are some of the elements or learning elements that you had to go through to be able to sit down and be able to write a JD for somebody and go through a hiring process? What are some of the things that you would impart onto somebody who might be 10 years in as a practitioner and then now starting to get those managing opportunities? Is there any words of advice or things to look out for during that transition that you would have for those people?
Oh, there's always going to be learnings. I know initially I was very much, I want to do it all. And eventually you get to a time where you need to start delegating and giving them ownership. So it's about empowering your staff and trusting them, not micromanaging them, coming in and helping when they need it, but giving them the autonomy to sort of run their programs, be a sounding board. I've been in the industry for a while. I've seen a lot of things, and a lot of them would just use me as a sounding board. What do you think? How have you handled this? But again, giving them some information and some education that they can make their own decisions based off sort of some of my advice and other advice that they've sought throughout the industry.
So you said you're working as a coach for the coaches now. So you'd be looking at working with people at a number of different levels, including the introductory level of coaches. What are some of the things that you're seeing from those coaches that you're really having to focus on? If I was to rephrase that question, I would ask, what are some of the advice that you would have for the people that are coming out of universities or entering their first job that they really need to focus on as young coaches?
I think everyone comes out of university and thinks they're going to walk into this great fancy job. I got a couple, I'll try not to get on a soapbox here, but I've got a couple of sort of thoughts along that. While they're in university, you need to do some type of coaching, whether that's athletics, whether that's swimming, whether that's strength conditioning, whatever it is, just learning to coach and learning to communicate. I think that's paramount. And also writing programs. I think there's a lot of really smart people that have got some great, the education system in Australia is amazing in terms of the caliber of sports science people we're pushing out in the industry. It's one, have you written a program before? Have you actually trained yourself? So what does it feel like to go through a max strength phase? What does it feel like to go through a hypertrophy phase? And then how can you expect an athlete to do that while they're doing their speed, so training yourself, I think, is really important. Experimenting a little bit on yourself with some different ideas. And that was one of the things I did in the US is we'd read all these great, I've changed my philosophy many times over the years. I went from very much, okay, you go through your general adaptation and a max phase to very much a conjugated phase and doing stuff with accommodating resistance. And a lot of time I'd almost use myself as a guinea pig to see how I felt before I'd roll that out on my athletes. So that's what I'd say. Just train, write programs, write as many programs as you can, because that's the way you're going to learn. I go back and look at some of the programs I wrote when I was young and I was like, well, what was I thinking there? But you'll learn and evolve and just keep it simple. You don't need to get on Instagram or read some fancy exercises that someone's using. Understand where you get to it, get the fundamentals right, and then you can add the the fancy things on top of it.
When you say write a lot of programs, what is that teaching you from your perspective? What is so valuable about writing a lot of those programs? Is it more the fact that you can sit back and evaluate where you've come from, or is it, is it an evaluation tool, or is it something that you learn more by just doing?
Bit of column A, bit of column B. So writing the programs, and whether that's doing it yourself or having someone, you might look at it and say, look, there was way too many pressing motions in there. I need more pulling motions. Or conversely, that, okay, that volume of squats isn't appropriate when I'm trying to do this volume of conditioning work in there. Even if you're someone that's never really don't have groups to train with, write a program, send it to a mentor or someone that they can look over it, and they might be able to pick something out of it, or they might even just question you, why are you doing that? If all of a sudden you've got a 3RM box squat on there and they don't have a training base underneath it, you're like, what are you doing? What are you thinking? Whereas they might say, look, this athlete's been training for 3 years. They've got a little bit of patellar tendonitis. I'm teaching them to use their hips a little bit more. Perfect. Great exercise to throw in there. But just having someone to look at the program and understanding how to put it together. And also monotony. If you're writing the same things over and over again, your athletes are going to go stir crazy. You're going to go stir crazy. It's putting some variety into that program to get the stimulus and being able to put some of that sports science into practice.
I like that idea of sending the programs to your mentors and getting them to check over it if you don't have anyone to test on. That's fantastic. Was there anything else that you wanted to get off your chest today, for whether it be the roles that you're doing at the moment, anything that you think back on in our conversation when, I actually wanted to elaborate on this, or anything more for young coaches? Was there anything else that you wanted to get out there, Paul?
Oh, it's a hard one. Don't be afraid to get your hands dirty. When I got in the industry, you'd have to wipe down all the equipment, you'd have to clean stuff up, you have to set it down. Just asking the senior coaches, what can I do to help? Do you need help setting up? Make yourself valuable. That it's when you've got a senior coach in there and you're in there helping, and they're having to tell you every single time what you need to do, you're just probably not going to get the buy-in. You've got to show some initiative, and you've got to ask questions. Probably the biggest thing, and make sure you get something from the program as well. And even, when I'm mentoring people, I want to make sure they get something from me. So I encourage them to ask questions. And, if they don't understand something or see something on my program, I'm not going to get offended if they ask me a question. Hopefully I've got a great justification or rationale while I've got it on the program.
You hope so.
and that's why you've just got to learn. It's when you come into the program and you just, you got to do your 20 hours for your level 2, and you're sitting there with your hands in your pocket and you're not really engaging anyone, then you're probably not going to get a job out of in the industry, because you're not going to get great feedback.
Yeah, you've got to want it. It's a theme that I've heard. I've done about 10 of these now. It's the theme I've heard countless times, is people just saying, look, it's gonna suck a little bit. There's gonna be things that you're gonna have to do, whether it be the unpaid internships where you're gonna have to do 20 to 30 hours a week non-paid, and then you're gonna have to go out and actually learn living with the other jobs. It's something that you're gonna have to do. Speaking of the 10 interviews that I've done, we sat down 2 years ago, and you were one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing this, because I just realized how much experience that you had. We were sitting there after one of the combines or one of the PD days for the state academies, and you just started telling stories. There were other coaches there, but you were telling stories about your time at Texas A&M, your time coming back here. And that was actually what inspired me to actually start doing this in this format, because I was sitting there like, wow, it'd be great to be able to package this and bottle this and put it out somewhere for people to be able to, young coaches especially, to be able to hear and learn from. So thank you for the inspiration piece, mate. I thought I'd just share that story with you as to why this all came about.
Well, I'm glad I can inspire someone, so that's good.
I really appreciate it, Paul. Those that are watching, if you want to watch more, I just did an interview with Ryan Schultz. He's a rugby coach out of Brisbane. You can watch that interview just here, and if you want to subscribe, you can click right there. For Paul, my name is James Grigson. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.